We'll explore the question of how Metro Boston, an area famous for history, became the epicenter of the modernist movement in America, and did so while facing one of the worst economic climates in our history. In essence, we want to explore the tremendous optimism behind the idea of completely radically changing the design of the city, coming up with new ideas with the belief that new materials and new techniques could create a better cityscape and a better world. So this is, I think, a very forward-thinking and very positive series. The following series are listed behind us, and I hope you'll be able to make it to all of them. We're very pleased to be working with the Concord Museum and Docomomo New England on producing these programs, and especially would like to thank our 3 speakers this evening who have been influential in the planning of the whole series. To get started, Mark Pasnik, Michael Kubo, and Chris Grimley are the co-directors of Pink Comma Gallery and collaborators in the design firm Over Under. Mark Pasnik is an associate professor of architecture at Wentworth Institute of Technology and has taught previously at the California College of Arts, Carnegie Mellon University, Northeastern University, and Rhode Island School of Design. Michael Kubo is a PhD candidate in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture at MIT, and a founding partner of the design practice Collective LOC. Chris Grimley is an adjunct professor at Northeastern University and has taught previously at the University of British Columbia, Rhode Island School of Design, and Wentworth Institute of Technology. Just so you know, their book, which is fantastic and is titled Heroic, will be available after the program in the lobby. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our 3 panelists.
In my throat, so I will not cough into it, I promise. But thank you very much to the Massachusetts Historical Society for having us here. We're extremely honored and privileged to be part of this series and to be the kind of kickoff lecture for the program. And just to start, to give you a range of why we're interested in this work and the sort of backgrounds of it, like the practice of Over Under, which is an architecture and design firm in Boston's South End, really works at the scale of books to buildings to actual cities. So, oh, can we get the? I can see it. There we go. All right, so we can go. There's us. Over Under. So looking at books, buildings, and cities, everything from museums in Guatemala to business districts in Abu Dhabi, through to exhibits and curatorial work around the city and around North America. And this project really began as an investigation in the gallery side of what we do, which we call Pink Comma. And the first show that you can see there next to 2007 was actually an exhibit that was instigated by Elizabeth Pageant at Architecture Boston magazine about what to do with City Hall, and she invited 7 young design firms, this is almost 10 years ago, to be part of the, rethinking or reimagining of City Hall with the kind of, blessing of Michael McKinnell and Gerhard Kalman, who was still alive at the time. And from that exhibit, we really started to focus on this idea of why Boston had a significant number of concrete buildings. And that culminated in October with the publication of Heroic, which really gathers a significant set of these buildings into a comprehensive narrative of how Boston changed during this moment in history. All right, and so as I said, we did this exhibit on City Hall, in which a number of us proposed additions, changes, and alterations to the building, and then it further expanded it into an exhibit and a number of articles which really looked at why Boston and why these buildings and why at this particular moment in history.
Okay. Everybody can hear me? Sort of, semi, okay. No? Better now? I am pressing the button. Does that do what it's? Just talk louder. Okay, I should just talk louder. All right, fair enough.
Like your.
Okay. So we describe the project as being about a city, a material, and a movement, and how all of these things came together in the period that we're looking at. And so the first question for us is, why heroic? In other words, why did we call the book that, and why do we use that term to refer to the movement that we're describing? Taking on the history that we're dealing with involves, first of all, taking on the history of a term that has come to be used to describe the buildings and the sort of architectural movement of this era, called Brutalism. It's a term that we find unsatisfactory to describe the buildings and the sort of era that we've been interested in for a series of different reasons. And so we address the history of the term in the book, but rather than trying to sort of pull people back to some of the original definitions of the term, we've actually decided that we're going to sort of put our stakes down with a new term that we feel might be better suited to reorienting the conversation to a kind of middle place where both the positives and the negatives of this work can be discussed. And so brutalism has a complex history as a term. It began from a few different strands, many of them in Europe. There were primarily the Smithsons and the Independent Group and others in the UK that were using the term as a kind of banner or as a sort of mantle for a certain notion of a kind of ethics and authenticity and honesty about architectural production in one's own time that would not dissimulate about the social realities and the corresponding architectural realities that buildings were meant to convey. In other words, at the architectural level, if there was plumbing in a building, that you would show the plumbing in a kind of honest way, you would show the structure and the materials and the kind of making of the building, the craft of it in an honest way, and that this would be sort of both positive and negative in the sense that it wouldn't hide the sometimes uncomfortable social realities that were operative. They were also at the same time using a term called heroic. I should say, by the way, that brutalism also has various other origins. It comes from the French béton brut, which was used most heavily to describe some of Le Corbusier's work after World War II, from art brut and contemporary movements as a kind of translation, etc. But at the same time, there was this other term, heroic, circulating around, also in use by the Smithsons. And in their description, they used heroic to refer to the era of what they saw as their avant-garde modernist predecessors, and a parallel call in their own time to match up to these achievements. And so this is their quote: "The heroic struggle of the first period of modern architecture had so closely passed before us, which gave us a sense of moral responsibility to invent for ourselves forms appropriate to the post-war period that would respond to the kind of similarly pressing needs of the time." At the same time, however, heroic was being used as a negative term increasingly by critics and architects like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, specifically in this book, Learning from Las Vegas. And they sort of weighed in against what they described as a negative as the heroic and original, as a way of making a kind of overly forceful architecture that was overly obsessed with a kind of abstract formal architectural language and relatively unconcerned with the problems of public communication, as against what they called, sort of ironically, the ugly and ordinary, which they were very much in favor of. And so this is a quote from them: "This is not the time, and ours is not the environment for heroic communication through pure architecture." And so we, in our project, we've sought to kind of collect all of these terms, and rather than reorient the discussion to a kind of renewed meaning of brutalism, we just kind of abandon the term altogether and really build up a history of this parallel term, heroic, which we see as a complex term, both positive and negative in these senses, that alludes to both the ambitions, the often utopian, heroic ambitions of people in the time period, but also the hubris that was kind of embedded in the sense of a tragic, the kind of tragic hero that always has a fatal flaw or an Achilles heel. Very briefly, sort of why Boston as the center point for this movement? As you can see, Boston after World War II was suffering rather heavily from the kind of problems that were facing a lot of cities, especially on the East Coast in the US, that were really the origins of what came to be known as the urban renewal movement. Boston had not had significant construction for over 15 years through the Depression and World War II. As you can see in the graph, there was population decline that these efforts were intended to stop quite heavily, or at least arrest, white flight to the suburbs, the decline of the city's tax base. There was a kind of pernicious tax assessment problem. The tax assessments for properties were artificially high and constrained development, et cetera. And so Boston was really struggling. A lot of neighborhoods were decrepit. Building stock had fallen into decay rather continuously for the previous some decades. And in this context, there were master plans like the one you see here, formulated that were really strong sort of governing visions for what would be built all the way, in many cases, up to the present. And it's only now that another comprehensive master plan is being produced. This was the last one produced in the previous 50 years up until the present. This intersected with the broader transatlantic movement that came to be known as urban renewal, and a serious part of that discourse was a discourse about city centers, whether cities could survive and the importance of city centers as part of that, and Boston was certainly a participant in that. And as you see from the character of some of these documents that really describe the center of the city as a site for bringing back both population, commerce, investment, and a kind of civic identity and faith to the city, which led to some of the more canonical urban renewal efforts and their built products. You can see the scale of the urban renewal leveling of properties in Boston, and then at their kind of major sites, Government Center, which came together through a series of master plans. This is the Adams-Howard-Greeley master plan, and that really were about providing a set of civic emblems of the city's transformation and revival, and also various kinds of transformative urban connections, for example, between Beacon Hill and the downtown through to the waterfront, through this kind of more sensitively sited intervention than previous efforts, significantly including the West End. Here you see the scale of the destruction, and then some of the products sort of it. These products were circulated rather heavily in architectural and public press at the time. This is a major part of our story. And you can see this is a special issue of Architectural Forum from 1964, devoted to Boston and to the urban renewal projects that were taking place. And we want to put up this title for you of the article that you see, The New Boston, Men, Projects, and an End to Despair. We'll sort of leave it there in all of its gendering and other such issues, but to convey this was the character of the discourse at the time. And there was also a focus internationally on some of the major players, many of whom I'm sure all of you know in the room, primary among which is Ed Logue, bold Boston gladiator. This is Life magazine, also from the 1960s, mid-1960s, as the kind of, let's say, both hero and villain of this tale, depending on one's point of view, and then in the same sorts of articles, also the community reaction, in this case, for proposed towers in the Back Bay, which never happened. The high spine was actually the thing that saved this kind of development, sort of scratching their heads, kind of wondering what it is, what was going on. So just briefly, the book seeks to cover a series of architectural products of this context, including the most famous ones, the ones that became really the central sites of this sign of civic investment and the revival of the city, chief among them Boston City Hall, and other government center buildings like the Government Service Center by Paul Rudolph, but also various kinds of institutional and educational buildings that were being built by Boston University, Harvard, MIT, and other institutions rather heavily at the time. Institutional buildings that were built by private clients, rather heavily by the finance sector, as a kind of old series of institutions in Boston that also participated rather heavily in this kind of transformation, like Boston 5-cent savings banks, Boston 5-cent savings. Public buildings like Madison Park School that we'll discuss a little bit more later, and then a series of unknown or lesser known projects that we tried to revive. For example, a series of experimental concrete houses built in Lincoln in the suburbs by Mary Otis Stevens and her partner at the time, Thomas McNulty, which are really an extraordinary series of buildings that we discuss. At the same time, there was also a strong climate of making spaces for teaching, working, and living in this kind of concrete modernist environment, and that they were all kind of connected together in a certain way. Chief among them was or sort of emblematically, was the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard, which was meant as an example of this kind of brutalist building as a site for teaching a certain relationship between the visual arts and the sort of cultured learning of the community and also of Harvard students. Other educational centers like the Boston Architectural Center by Ashley Meyer and Associates, that was the first dedicated, sort of modern dedicated building for the study of architecture, which was another competition done almost immediately after the Boston City Hall competition, although lesser known. None of these entries have ever been published prior to this book, and which was seen as a building that should be powerful enough to communicate the qualities of architecture to a broad public and in a way explain the value of architecture at the same time that it would be a teaching institution for architects in this language. Sites of working for architects built in this style. At the center of it was the Architect's Corner, so-called, in Cambridge, in Harvard Square, which is still there, which was anchored around buildings like the Architects Collaborative headquarters, built in this style, which then were sort of announced to the public by really emblematic, iconic buildings like the Design Research building by Benjamin Thompson and Associates. So that's a little bit the spectrum of what we tried to cover out of this era among the highlights in the book.
And so just to frame the book a little bit, or the structure of the book, we really have these two brackets at the front and the back. At the front, historical essays by ourselves and several notable architectural historians, the interminable Douglas Shantucci of local fame and intellectual fortune, I believe, and Keith Morgan, who is at Boston University, Elizabeth Cohen, who is at Radcliffe, who is going to be on another panel with me later in the month, but is writing a sort of book-length study of Logue and this time period, and then Joan Achman, who really looks at the international roots of this project, of the heroic and brutalist project. And then the middle of the book, the real heart of the book, are 23 projects, which are organized in the categories that Michael alluded to earlier. And then finally, for us, the real, I think, where the heart, well, the soul of the book lies, is in several interviews that we did with the protagonists of the era. It's like with people like Peter Shemaev of Cambridge 7, Harry Cobb of I Am Pei, Araldo Casuda, all of these voices that were working at the time period to really understand and comprehensively tell the stories that surrounded the construction and potential that these buildings really stood for when they went up. And so to sort of frame this a little bit, we wanted to do a couple of case studies about two of our buildings that are in the book that highlight the various ways in which the city was transformed and the transformative nature that these buildings encompassed. And the first one that I want to look at briefly is Madison Park High School, right, which is a sort of little-known Marcel Breuer project just on the edge of Dudley Square in Roxbury. And so here we have an aerial photograph of the project, and it's bounded by Northeastern and the police station are here, Malcolm X Boulevard running to the south of it, and really the initial project was this entire block. And it first appears in that comprehensive master plan of 65, 75 as a magnet school that would reestablish the academic experience for high school students in the city. Logue and Paul Rudolph at the time really envisioned this as a center for approximately 5,000 students, which would encompass the arts, technology, trade schools, performing arts schools, like just a real sort of feather in the cap for the way public education could be reformed through this process. And after the appearance in the comprehensive plan, Marcel Breuer and Associates was hired to sort of implement a vision for the campus itself. And it initially took a form, a much more heroic form than its extant form at the moment, which was this sort of trident form that was a 9-story tower which would house each one of these academic institutions. It was flanked on either side by a couple of cultural buildings. So there's a performance school over here, a number of sort of low-rise buildings which were specialties for science and technological studies, and then a sort of renewed housing model, you know, the slab in the park, if you want to call it, that sort of framed that edge of the proposal. But what's important to note here is also at this time, the ring road, which was proposed along Tremont and was still in the running, right? And so, you know, this was the building that was to sort of take place there, and you can kind of see a couple of Breuerisms emerging for those of you who are familiar with Breuer's work of the period. A lot of this sort of precast language that's in places like housing, urban development, and right, so you get this sort of precast language. You also get this very expressive sort of formalisms that, you know, show up in his work at Yale and in other places. And this scheme didn't quite, it didn't capture the imagination in a way that was warranted. And so there were several other schemes that ended up being explored, including this low-rise one, which then took the academics and split them into several houses along what now is Malcolm X Boulevard. Right, and we can see a little bit of the perspective looking down that road. And so this project went through many phases of its development, and for us the crucial phase of its development goes back to that article that Michael showed earlier about Ed Logue and Boston's Bold Gladiator. During the kind of hyperbole and the rather, I don't know, not so nuanced public debates that happened around this period, we get figures like Kathleen Craven and William Foley, and if we look a little closer at the caption next to Logue there, it says he has new arch enemies on the city council far left. Miss Kathleen Craven once said, "The resemblances between Logue and Hitler are striking." This is in Life magazine, right? And Bill Foley calls the Boston Redevelopment Authority's work surgery by a quack, right? So there was this immense opposition to a lot of these projects from the more, I guess, colorful characters of Boston's mid-century history. And this project really is affected by that. Louise de Hicks. So, city councilor, head of the Boston School Board at the time, was against the location of this project due to it being in Roxbury, right? She did not think that an appropriate location for the school was there, so she fought it tooth and nail for years and years and years, which eventually led to the federal government suing the city of Boston to implement this building as part of the Racial Imbalance Act. And so this project, while the history of the book, or the history of the time period that we're looking at, is like 1960 to 1976. This project started in 63 and was opened in 77. Right, so it was really encumbered by the kind of political conditions and political environment that was really rocking Boston's core at this time. But the building, as opened, is actually a remarkable piece, regardless of the trials and tribulations that it went through. It has this wonderful three typologies of concrete in it. It has this board-formed base, which you can see here. The stairs dropping down. It has this precast system which houses, cabinets for books. It houses the mechanical system, operable windows, everything going on there. And then it also has this split-face concrete masonry unit, which forms the volumes of the three 3 or 4 special buildings with the gymnasiums and laboratories and a pool and everything else. And remarkably, the building has held up fairly well. This is photos of it last summer. You know, there's a lot of, this building gets in the news a lot about the kind of quality of education that is happening there, or the lack of quality of education that's happening there. And you know, we hope that the bones of the building and the structure of the building can withstand the pressures that it's under right now, and really rise to the occasion to once again serve as a site for children being educated in the public school system of Boston.
So I get to talk, Chris always likes to talk about the political side of things, and his speaking in the group at the later session will be on politics. Michael will be talking about culture, and I get to talk about preservation. And you know, one of our thoughts on these building types is that not all of them deserve to be preserved or even stay as they are today, but that we're in favor of understanding them with much greater depth than the public does today before we make decisions about their future. And City Hall is perhaps the key example in that. We always like to say it's the third rail of concrete architecture. It's the thing that people get up in arms about, sometimes very passionately in favor and sometimes very passionately against. But for us, it's a really admirable building with incredibly strong ideas and thoughts behind it. And what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of a dive into the building's origins and some of the ideas behind it. Chris mentioned a big part of the book is dedicated to interviews, including with Michael McKinnell, who is the architect of this building. We've spent a lot of time with him, and before he passed away, Gerhard Kallmann, who was the other architect. And we've also done quite a lot of diving into archives as part of this to find really wonderful photographs and drawings. It's great to have Lorna Condon here today from Historic New England, that has supported us in this project enormously by digging up some really wonderful drawings throughout the history of the project. I'll also say one other side note, which is that Michael presented a competition for the Boston Architectural College, and I'm going to talk a little bit about City Hall's competition. We're working right now on doing an exhibit which will include some historic New England drawings at the Boston Architectural College of those two competitions and understanding them as a moment in the history of the evolution of Boston. The City Hall competition itself began in 1961, and it was really seen as a way to overcome some of the problems that the city faced, particularly with the lingering sense rooted in the Curley era that the city was corrupt. And the competition was seen as a way to demonstrate that the city could build a new building without political processes, the kind of political processes Chris just described, but that in effect a building could be done through a kind of ennobled professional process. And so the competition was laid out in 1961, and based on a very detailed, what we would call a program brief or a competition brief, developed by a professor at MIT and led by the Government Center Commission. And it outlined really many of the things that we see in the building today. So I think if you love or hate the building today, you have to understand its origins in the nature of the competition itself. The first deadline for the competition was in early 1962, and 256 architects submitted designs for this building. An enormous competition. It was really the first competition of its kind for a civic building of this type in the US in a generation. I think the most recent one before that was San Francisco City Hall at a very different era in the early 1900s. There had been smaller ones, but this really rejuvenated the idea of doing competitions. 8 firms were selected as finalists in, I think, January or February 1962, and they were each given $5,000 to develop their schemes further and to submit them later in the spring. And you can see those 8 finalists. So if you don't like the current building, you could see what some things you could have had if we didn't do it. But these range in some really interesting ways. I think some of them tend to be, let's say, a little bit more corporate looking and straightforward. One of them seems maybe even more powerful or big scale or bombastic in some ways. And then the Mitchell-Jurgula and the Kalman McKinnell were widely seen by the jury as the two finalists, as the two selected projects. So the Mitchell-Jurgula being the runner-up scheme, according to the jury, and Kalman McKinnell being selected. Of course, you know the project. This is a Historic New England drawing from their collection. And the jury was fascinated with this particular scheme for many different characteristics. In their 4-page letter that they wrote as the competition final report, the jury declared it achieves great monumentality, drama, and unity, the play of light and shade, the richness of forms and spaces, and a strong focus for the symbol of government. It is a daring yet classical architectural statement. And the jurors, 4 of the jurors were heads of architecture schools across the country: Rapson, Worcester, Netsch, and Belusky. They taught they led many architecture schools at the time. They were distinguished architects themselves. And they all went to school at some point in Boston, so they understood the city well. And they understood that this building could be about a new vision for a place that they believed in, but which had, in many respects, lost its way during the eras leading up to this time. The selection of Kalman McKinnell's project unleashed what was called a dignified controversy, a very Bostonian way of thinking about controversy. On City Hall, there were those who praised it, those who loved it, and of course the critics varied in their response. The architecture critics hailed it. Politicians sometimes had mixed reactions. I love this cartoon where the happiest critic is the pigeon, who seems to love it there. Big smiles. He's got something to go for. But the building, I think, is really a wonderful essay on many different factors, some of which is the nature of the competition, the origin points. In particular, the competition described 3 different types of programs for the building. So there was a bureaucratic set of spaces, so places for the offices, for everyday activities for city workers and city staff. And you can see, of course, that bureaucratic layer is the top layer. Then at the lower level, there were programs that were defined as public functions for the vast public, and that's the lower layer of the building, which is brick, so it's continuous with the landscape around it. It's meant to be engaging for the public to enter. And in between these two were what were called the ceremonial functions, things like the chamber for government action, the mayor's office suite, the city council chamber and the mayor's office suite. Those were really the 2 biggest functions of those. And you can see those elements are expressed on the outside. So here we have the mayor's office, and over here on this side, projecting the other way, we have the city council chamber. And in between are these very bold and tall columns, much like a classical building might have, but at a grand scale, meant to express civic aspiration, meant to be of that kind of scale. The building's also a very interesting synthesis of many of the ideas that were happening at the time. So looking for a robust, powerful, strong architecture that concrete could support, but also integrating ideas about the systems of a building. So it's here you can see some of the heating systems that run through those outside fins that you see on the outside of the building. So the design integrated these things that we often hide in our buildings, but architects at this era loved to do that. It integrated a structural idea, so really every element of this building is conceived. Nothing's left to chance, nothing's left to someone else to stuff something behind a hidden roof or hidden ceiling. And the truss system is developed by a very well-known engineer, Lemessurier, and it's what's called a Virendale truss. So it has these verticals and horizontals, and then space between that allows for the building's mechanical systems to run through and to be shown to us. Again, like Michael was talking about with that ethic, to put things on display, to put the realities of the building on display. There was certainly also an obsession with concrete, and one of my favorite quotes from Michael McKinnell during our interview, he talks about this very effect. He says, "I think if we could have done it, we would have used concrete to make the light switches." Everything was conceived in one material that could be seen to do so much and to be a kind of rich tool of description. As I mentioned, the building, when it opens to great celebration, especially in the architectural press. It's the cover of many magazines. It's recognized widely. It also opened to very civic events. So the ballet performed during the opening week. Arthur Fiedler of the Pops conducted an opening event. Lots of champagne, lots of fancy gowns, all sorts of stuff. It was heralded as a kind of vision of the new Boston, again, unencumbered by the old world of politics, and shown, the city shone in a new light through a new kind of architecture. It's widely influential across the globe. You can see some of the buildings that it influenced on the left. The Birmingham Library, which was just torn down very recently, unfortunately. On the top right is Sears headquarters in Toronto. The bottom left, which I think is a pretty mediocre ripoff, but pretty direct in terms of its reference to City Hall. And then maybe a more elegant version that was proposed for Baghdad, but remains unbuilt. The architecture itself, and one of the things I think that remains a problem is what Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic for the New York Times, called the architecture gap, a gap between the quality of the building and the public's perception of it. And in many respects, she says Boston can celebrate with the knowledge that it has produced a superior public building in an age that values cheapness over quality as a form of public virtue. It also has one of the handsomest buildings around, and thus far, one of the least understood. That's pretty prescient, 1969, she says that. What's that?
February 4th, 1969.
Oh yeah, tomorrow in 1969. The building and many of these buildings, many of the concrete buildings, were really understood in relationship to Boston as a historic city. So they were meant to express permanence and strength and solidity and all these kinds of virtues that could be tied to the civic realm, to government buildings or other kinds of buildings. And they were also meant to connect closely to a masonry city. While today we often perceive them as alien to our city, the architects at the time found them to be closer to a masonry tradition than a glass and steel building would be, for instance. So they're thick, they're heavy, they have deep set windows, they have strong shadows, very much similar to the simple granite warehouse buildings that they admired so much in the historic fabric around them. I think that sense of them as good participants in the fabric, as well as, so that they related to the old, but they also presented a new vision, was what really attracted the architects. It was a new language, but one that they felt was in keeping with the place. Over the years, I think that sense of them has evolved. The sense of them as civic buildings, as open buildings, as democratic buildings has now evolved. Today, we see them in something like Black Mass. It's now, City Hall is now portrayed as an FBI headquarters, as a kind of negative building. In the Friends of Eddie Coyle, it appeared, as a government structure, but in sort of a grim story, I would say. And even more recently, there's a sense of it as a kind of dystopian building. This is the existing bridge. Everybody seems to love to film on this bridge inside. The existing bridge. This is a stage set version of it as a droid ad, and then the same space being used in Black Mass today. But really in that time period from its opening to today, there's been a shift in who we are, in our understanding of government, in our maybe distance from trusting government compared to in the 60s. And that shift has happened around the building, but the building itself hasn't changed much. There's also an etymological problem with the whole site. We looked up the word monstrosity on Google, and in Google's definition, there are not one, but two references to concrete monstrosities. Like, why can't you define that word with other kinds of monstrosities? You have a multi-story monstrosity of raw concrete and a concrete monstrosity. Right? Why is it so embedded that concrete is such a negative term, when in fact the origination of these were very positive and very civic? So there's been a kind of narrative that's grown around these buildings that I think comes from a misunderstanding of them, from misdirection, even from sources like our duck boat friends and our tour guide friends who always reference some random travel website that said it was one of the 10 ugliest buildings in the world. That's not fact. That has nothing to do with actuality. But it's become a perceived and carried narrative forward. And I think that's one of the aspects of the book that we want to take on, is understanding the depth and the thoughtfulness and the power of these buildings. Not to say that they're perfect. As Michael mentioned, there is the kind of Achilles heel to them. They had ambition beyond maybe what we should allow them to have, but to really understand them before we judge them in that way. Moving to today, it's a major set of questions that face us as a society about these buildings. They're almost all now 50 years old, or in that age range, and many of them need to be repaired. Many of them need new building systems. Many need major investment. And unfortunately, many of them are also being torn down quite rapidly. These are all examples of buildings that have or are in the process of being torn down, and the lower set of slides shows what's being proposed to replace them. All thin, flimsy, lightweight buildings compared to these heroic works. We've not had the greatest tradition ourselves here in Boston. We've lost the MLK School, Eastern Airlines terminal, and at some point we're going to lose the Government Center parking garage. We've also made mutants out of some of these. This is the Architects Collaborative Children's Hospital, which you can see got wrapped in a very, almost like a food court mall building around it. And so those heroic gestures of these, forms are then wrapped in something with bad signage. And, this moment kills me. How could you do that to a building of this nature? Just wrap it in something that's a fake cornice. If these buildings were all about their authenticity, this is like the exact worst thing to turn the architects over in their grave when they would imagine this. But I don't think all hope is lost. There's a wave of buildings that are being transformed and preserved and renovated with much deeper intelligence. So Brunner Kott, for instance, has been transforming the Boston University School of Law and Education by Josep Lluís Sert. They added many things to it. They changed the way the building works. But they also resuscitated its language. They brought back its color, its character, and some of the positive characteristics of the building at the same time. Another example I like to talk about, we were involved in the preservation process, the landmarking process of the Christian Science Center a few years ago. And at the time, really the church, which has been, I think, a very good steward of the complex over the years, didn't particularly want to landmark it because, of course, sometimes landmarking can not allow you to do as much as you might want to do as a property owner. But landmarking went through thanks to the force of a lot of people in the preservation and historical realms. And now the tower of the Christian Science Center is owned by, or leased, long-term leased to a developer. And if you look at the signage around it, it touts it's a landmark. It's a landmark status. And so it's gone from something where landmarking was maybe opposed on a light level to something where now landmarking is being embraced. And the building is really being transformed in a wonderful way and celebrated for its very nature. It's been improved, but it's also celebrated for its very nature. And Chris started with, our whole project really began with Mayor Menino saying, tear down City Hall or sell it, let's move out. That got us stirred up, got us a little bit angry, and got us thinking. So, that happened in 2006. Flash forward to 2015, and Joyce Linehan, who's the mayor's chief of policy, hosted us at her house to have a talk with city officials about this building and its future. And the city is now engaging in many ways of rethinking the complex. There have been many things, what we might call tactical urbanist changes, these small-scale interventions that are meant to make people engage with the building more actively. But I think there's also an effort and an interest from the city in doing a larger scale and intelligent planning about how to fix and make City Hall a better building. One of the things that we've proposed in that, and we're actually members, we're historical advisors to the team studying the building, is to return back to the original values, which were never fully realized. But those values were that the building would be what Michael McKinnell called the start of a process that would engage successive generations of the citizenry in the embellishment, decoration, and adornment of the robust armature that we had designed. Things like the Boston Pops playing in that main space, or many decorating the building with new art, or engaging it in new kinds of public life was what the intent of the building, it's the very DNA of the building, is supposed to happen. And what's really happened over the last generations is that it's changed very little. City budgets are smaller than they should be. There hasn't been the ability to maintain the building, and so it's suffered over its lifetime. And this aspiration, I think, for it to be a changing, evolving work of architecture is something that we can perhaps aspire to in the future. So in the end, this project, I think, is one about understanding the period and then thinking forward a little bit to how that understanding can shape the future of these buildings.